Having looked at the tradition of Christian pacifism and some of the problems associated with Christian pacifism, in this presentation we begin to look at what is probably the most dominant perspective within the Christian communities, and that is just war theory. You will recall that one of the criticisms of Christian pacifism was the claim that Christian pacifists are naive about the reality of human sin. Just war theorists certainly are committed to the idea that sin, an ongoing reality in human life, both individually and collectively, sin makes conflict inevitable in human history. And because of that, a second underlying conviction, protecting or promoting or sustaining situations of relative justice typically require the use of force, coercive force, violent force, deadly force to maintain them. A third underlying conviction is that Christian love, that love for all people, sometimes requires violent force to restrain one neighbor who is attacking or abusing or violating another neighbor. Darrell Cole, who is one of the folks I've asked you to read, who takes a just war perspective, has written this: defenders of the just war tradition regret that they live in a world where they have to kill human beings in order to restrain evil. That is to say, they regret the fall, referring to the fall of humanity into sin as spoken of in the book of Genesis. But they find it to be even more regretful for Christians to stand idly by while people are being abused and killed unjustly. Implicit there, of course, is the assumption that all pacifists do is idly stand by. A fourth conviction that underlies just war theory is the idea that governments exist to maintain order, security, and justice using violence or the sword. Now you will recognize here an overlap between that idea that institutions like government are divine ordinances, gifts of God to us, specifically for the purpose of restraining evil. And the use of violence in that restraint of evil is a part of what God has authorized. This, of course, is based on that passage with which you have become familiar, Romans 13. A fifth underlying conviction has to do with the place of love in Christian just war theory. We've already seen that love, from this perspective, may require us to intervene violently on behalf of one neighbor over against another who is attacking or abusing or oppressing. The point to add here is that because of the idea of love, that violence we use against the evil neighbor, you might say, to restrain that evil, must still be limited, must be restrained. That's how love of enemy still plays a role even within just war theory. We may have to attack, we may have to kill, we may have to wage war, but love requires us to restrain our violence against even the evil neighbor who has become our enemy. Let me say a little something here about the historical development of just war theory. I've said the early church was pacifist. Just war theory develops after the conversion of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Emperor Constantine, to Christianity in the early 4th century. St. Augustine, a 4th century and 5th century theologian and bishop, first developed just war theory, drawing upon Greek sources, and it was further developed by the famous medieval theologian, Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas, and by the Dutch Protestant Hugo Grotius. It lost favor, but has been revived in the 20th century in Roman Catholic social teaching, in the teaching of United Methodist Paul Ramsey, and most recently in the work of the British theologian Nigel Biggar. One of the things you should be aware of is that just war theory cannot be found in the Bible. But that is not to say that it does not have a basis in the Bible. Surely, as we've already seen, just war theory will appeal to Romans 13 and the idea that God has authorized the state or the civil authorities to use the sword in the restraint of evil. Surely also its assumption that human reality is characterized by sin that makes conflict inevitable is grounded in the Bible's general awareness of the reality of human sin. And finally, its attempts to be faithful to the concept of Christian love represent or is grounded in the biblical affirmation that all human beings are created in the divine image and all are to be objects of our love. Now, of course, we may rightly ask, what about Jesus' nonviolent teachings and example? Those teachings and that example which are so important for Christian pacifism. What just war thinkers do is make a series of distinctions that enable them to take Jesus' pacifist sayings seriously, not just throwing them out, while at the same time justifying war and military service. What those distinctions do is to restrict the range of application or to reduce the weight or strength of Jesus' pacifist teachings such that the use of violence under certain circumstances is seen as justified from within a Christian perspective. Now, the first distinction sometimes drawn by just war thinkers is between those Christians with higher callings as opposed to those with lower callings. You might say the ordinary Christian in the pew. The idea is that Jesus' pacifist teachings apply only to those with those high callings, whereas ordinary Christians, the Christian in the pew, is not bound by Jesus' pacifist teachings. So those with higher callings would be, in the Catholic context, priests, monks, and nuns. They represent God's grace and God's love. They represent the salvation that God offers, and therefore they must follow the teaching and example of Jesus. But the ordinary Christian has a lesser set of responsibilities. Consider this passage from Darrell Cole. How can we follow Christ, even at a distance, while fighting and killing? Calvin gives us an indication by pointing out that Christ's pacific nature, his willingness to suffer violence at the hand of the Jewish and Roman authorities, is grounded in the priestly office of reconciliation and intercession that is reserved for him alone. Christ's pacific nature is thus inextricably tied to his role as Redeemer and cannot be intended as a model for Christian behavior. No Christian can or should try to act as a Redeemer, but all can and should follow Christ in obeying the commands of the Father. And the Father commands the just use of force. Now, Cole's reflections seem to suggest that Jesus' pacifist teaching and example apply only to him. But you can see how his idea that that is grounded in his priestly office could also be tied or seen as obligations for priests, monks, nuns, clergy. Another distinction that has been drawn is between self-regarding behavior and other-regarding behavior. The idea here is that Jesus' teachings about non-resistance or non-violence apply to the self, apply to self-defense. So love would mean you could not defend yourself violently, but it would not mean that you could not or should not defend others even violently, if necessary. This would reflect that idea that you should turn your own cheek, but you may not turn the neighbor's cheek. So if I am attacked, it would be wrong for me to defend myself. But where my behavior affects more than one other person, where one of my neighbors is attacking another of my neighbors, love may well require me to intervene, even violently, to protect the abused neighbor from the violence of the sinful or evil neighbor in this context. A related distinction moves this self and other distinctions over into the idea of roles and puts it in the institutional context, you might say. The idea here would be that an individual in their private capacity, when their own interests and are the only thing at stake, may not use violence. There's where Jesus' teachings apply. But in a Christian person's public roles, that is to say, as a police officer or as a soldier, where he or she represents not himself and his or her own interests, but the common good, or the interests of society, or the state, or the interests of all their neighbors. In those roles where they play that representative, or they have that representative function, their violence is justified. So privately, we may not use violence, but publicly, to protect justice, the common good, the neighbor, we may. Another interesting distinction that just warriors sometimes make is between our inner attitude or disposition and our outer behavior. Augustine was the first to draw this distinction, and his basic argument was that Jesus' command to love the neighbor, including the enemy, means that we may not hate them. We may not have an attitude of hatred toward them. But that does not mean that our outer conduct toward them cannot be violent or even destructive. The simplest way to put this is we may kill the enemy out of necessity to protect the offended neighbor, to protect justice or security, but we may not hate the neighbor. Jesus' teaching applies to our inner attitude or disposition, but not necessarily to our outer conduct. In 2013, Nigel Bigger, a professor of moral and pastoral theology at Oxford University, published a book called In Defense of War. That book is being hailed, rightly, as one of the most profound and important defenses of just war theory in recent decades. Much of his defense of just war theory hinges upon something like this distinction between an inner attitude or disposition of love and outward conduct that is violent or deadly. One of his chapters is called Love in War, and among the things he does in that chapter is to attend to what soldiers on the battlefield have actually said about their experience and their feelings. He concludes that chapter this way. The testimony that I have adduced is firsthand and comes from frontline soldiers in 6 wars spanning almost a century from 1914 to 2012. It contradicts the charge that military violence is mainly and necessarily motivated by hatred. It disturbs the assumption that battlefield hatred is always morally unfitting and ungovernable. It confirms the thesis that soldiers are usually motivated primarily by love for their comrades. And it supports the claim that they can regard their enemies with respect, solidarity, and even compassion, all of which are forms of love. Therefore, the notion that love can govern the use of violence is no mere academic fantasy. Love can be active in the making of war. Augustine was right. Another way in which Bigger defends the idea that killing in war and love are not contradictory is through an analysis of intentions. He argues that those soldiers on the battlefield killing the enemy or the enemy's death is not their ultimate intention. What they intend, he says, is to stop the enemy so as to preserve justice and achieve peace. Unfortunately, on the battlefield, stopping the enemy typically requires killing them. He writes this: "The life of the human individual is precious. No one should choose to want or intend to damage or destroy such precious life. Nevertheless, it may be permissible to choose to act in such a way as to cause the death of a human being, provided that what is intended is something other than death, for example, defending the innocent, and that the possibility or even certainty of his death is accepted with an appropriate and manifest reluctance. Morally speaking, to cause death in this fashion is not the same as intending to kill." I have actually had breakfast with Bigger recently and heard him tell the story of a soldier in Afghanistan who saw a child peering above the barricades, obviously spying for the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. He didn't want to kill him, but his commanding officer told him, the next time that child appears, you must kill him. And he did. But Bigger used that as an example to say that the soldier did not intend the death of that child. He accepted it with appropriate and manifest reluctance. And his ultimate intention was to defend the innocent, not to kill that child. All of this suggests, I think, that it is right to locate Bigger within this category of a distinction between inner attitude or disposition, where Jesus' command to love applies most directly, and outward behavior that may involve death and killing. A final distinction that just war thinkers often draw is between eternity and time, or between a moral ideal and that which is practical morally. The idea here would be that Jesus' nonviolent teaching and example are a symbol of the best for human beings and the best for human society. They are they represent the way humans ought to behave and the way humans will behave in the kingdom of God, or when God finishes that transformation of human nature and of the world which God promises. But in time, in history, where sin and conflict are inevitable, those teachings about nonviolence and complete pacifism are impractical. In time and in history, we must think practically, realistically, about what behavior best serves the interests and the welfare of our neighbor. And in that context of sin and conflict, violence may sometimes be necessary in order to practically protect the justice and the peace that is possible within the confines of human history. So here in one place you can see these distinctions all laid out. On the left are those realms, those dimensions, those aspects of the moral life to which Jesus' nonviolent teachings and example do apply. They apply to those with higher callings. They apply when our behavior only affects ourselves. They apply when we are acting in our private role. They apply to our inner attitude or feelings. And they are symbols of what life will be like when the kingdom of God comes in eternity, and symbols of ideal human behavior. But to those with ordinary callings, and when our behavior affects others and not merely ourselves, in our public roles, in this world, in human history, in time, practically speaking, Jesus' teachings do not apply. This then concludes our introduction to just war theory. Next time we'll look in fairly significant detail at the two sets of criteria that just war theory has developed. The jus ad bellum criteria for thinking about when it's appropriate to go to war, and the jus in bello criteria, which determine what one may actually do within war. But that's for next time.